Between 1999 and 2023, more than 800,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. That is more than every American soldier killed in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. In a single year, 2016, more Americans died from drug overdoses than died in the entire Vietnam War. This is the deadliest drug epidemic in the history of the United States. And it was not an accident. It was a business plan. Behind the crisis sits a single family. A family that built a pharmaceutical empire worth tens of billions of dollars. A family that funded their name onto the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, the British Museum, and the Smithsonian. A family that was celebrated as one of the great philanthropic dynasties in American history. And a family that, according to federal prosecutors, state attorneys general, and thousands of pages of internal documents, deliberately misled doctors, manipulated medical science, and flooded the country with the most addictive prescription painkiller ever mass-marketed, all while extracting more than $10 billion in personal wealth from the company before it collapsed into bankruptcy. Their name is Sackler, and this is the story of how they poisoned America. Chapter 1. The Advertising Genius. The Sackler dynasty begins not with a pill, but with a man who understood something about medicine that most doctors refuse to acknowledge. Doctors are susceptible to marketing. Arthur Sackler was born in Brooklyn in 1913 to Jewish immigrant parents from Eastern Europe. He was brilliant, relentless, and pathologically ambitious. He paid his way through NYU School of Medicine by working as a copywriter at a medical advertising agency called William Douglas McAdams. By 1947, he had purchased the agency outright. He was simultaneously a practicing psychiatrist, a medical researcher, and a pharmaceutical advertising executive, a combination that would be considered a staggering conflict of interest today, but was perfectly legal in mid-20th century America. Arthur Sackler did not invent pharmaceutical advertising, but he perfected it. He pioneered the strategy of marketing drugs directly to physicians through medical journal advertisements, free drug samples, and armies of sales representatives who visited doctors' offices armed with glossy brochures and clinical studies. His most famous campaign was for Valium, manufactured by Hoffmann La Roche. Arthur promoted Valium not as a drug for the seriously mentally ill, but as a lifestyle medication for the everyday stresses of modern life. Anxiety, tension, sleeplessness. He made Valium the first drug in history to reach $100 million in annual sales, and by 1971, Valium and its sister drug Librium had earned over $2 billion for their manufacturer. The Medical Advertising Hall of Fame, which posthumously inducted Arthur in 1997, wrote that no single individual did more to shape the character of medical advertising than Dr. Arthur Sackler. He proved that a drug's commercial success was determined not by its clinical superiority, but by the sophistication of its marketing. He turned medicine into a consumer product. Arthur Sackler died in 1987. His estate was valued at approximately $140 million. After his death, his heirs sold their one-third stake in the family's pharmaceutical company, Purdue Frederick, to Arthur's two brothers, Raymond and Mortimer Sackler, for $22 million. Arthur's branch of the family walked away from the company entirely. This is the critical fork in the story. Everything that followed, the fortune, the scandal, the hundreds of thousands of dead, was the work of Raymond and Mortimer's side of the family. But it was Arthur's playbook, the blueprint for turning a pharmaceutical product into a marketing juggernaut, that made it all possible. Chapter 2. The Pill That Changed Everything. Raymond and Mortimer Sackler had been running Purdue Frederick quietly for decades. The company manufactured a range of modest pharmaceutical products, including laxatives and earwax removers. It was profitable but unremarkable. That changed in 1984 when Purdue released OxyContin, a controlled-release morphine pill for cancer patients. OxyContin was a breakthrough, a single pill that released morphine slowly over 12 hours, eliminating the need for patients to take medication every 4 hours. It generated approximately $400 million in annual revenue at its peak. But OxyContin's patent was expiring. The family faced a financial cliff. They needed a successor product. The answer was OxyContin. Approved by the FDA in December 1995, OxyContin used the same controlled-release technology to deliver oxycodone, a powerful synthetic opioid, over a 12-hour period. In theory, it was a legitimate medical product for patients with severe chronic pain. In practice, it became the most aggressively marketed and catastrophically destructive prescription drug in American history. The marketing began immediately. Purdue, now renamed Purdue Pharma, deployed a massive sales force that more than tripled from 318 representatives in 1996 to over 1,000 by 2002. These representatives were specifically trained to tell doctors that OxyContin carried a low risk of addiction. Their primary weapon was a 5-sentence letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980 by two researchers named Porter and Jick. The letter had examined nearly 12,000 hospitalized patients who received short-term narcotics and found only 4 cases of addiction. Purdue instructed its sales force to cite this letter as evidence that the addiction rate for opioids was less than 1%. There was a critical problem with this claim. The Porter and Jick letter described hospitalized patients receiving brief, monitored doses of narcotics. It said nothing about outpatients taking powerful opioids for months or years. Purdue took a narrow observation about short-term hospital use and weaponized it into a blanket assurance about long-term addiction risk. Over 72% of subsequent medical articles that cited the Porter and Jick letter repeated the less than 1% claim without noting the hospitalized context. The lie metastasized through the medical literature like a virus. At OxyContin's launch party in 1996, Richard Sackler, Raymond's son and the company's president, told attendees that the launch would be followed by, in his words, a blizzard of prescriptions that would bury the competition. He was right. OxyContin sales exploded from $48 million in 1996 to nearly $1.1 billion by the year 2000. Purdue spent $200 million on marketing in 2001 alone. Sales representatives earned average bonuses of $71,500, with some bonuses reaching $240,000. The company distributed approximately 34,000 free starter coupons, giving patients a 7 to 30-day supply of OxyContin at no cost, creating a pipeline of new users who would soon need refills. The blizzard had arrived, and it was burying far more than the competition. Chapter 3. The Body Count. The death toll began almost immediately. OxyContin was designed to release oxycodone slowly over 12 hours, but users quickly discovered that if you crush the pill, the entire 12-hour dose was released at once, delivering a powerful, instantaneous high nearly identical to heroin. Purdue knew this was happening. Internal documents later revealed in litigation showed that the company received reports of abuse, addiction, and overdose deaths within the first years of OxyContin's release. They did not pull the drug. They did not restrict the marketing. They expanded it. When reports of addiction began surfacing in the press, Richard Sackler's response, preserved in a February 2001 email uncovered during litigation, was chilling. He wrote that the company needed to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals. The company's strategy was not to acknowledge a flaw in the product. It was to blame the victims. The numbers are staggering. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documented that from 1999 to 2023, approximately 806,000 Americans died from opioid-involved overdoses. In a single year, 2023, roughly 80,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses alone. At the peak of the crisis, opioid overdose deaths were nearly 10 times higher than they had been in 1999. More Americans died from overdoses in 2016 than died in the worst single year of the AIDS epidemic. These are not abstract numbers. They represent entire communities hollowed out. In rural Appalachia, towns that had already been devastated by the collapse of the coal industry were flooded with OxyContin prescriptions. Pill mills, clinics that operated essentially as legal drug dealers, wrote thousands of prescriptions with no legitimate medical justification. In some West Virginia counties, pharmacies received enough opioid pills to supply every man, woman, and child with hundreds of doses per year. Families disintegrated. Foster care systems overflowed with children whose parents were dead or incapacitated. Morgues ran out of space. In 2010, Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make the pills harder to crush, a move the company promoted as a safety measure. The reformulation used a polymer that made the pills turn gummy when crushed, preventing them from being snorted or injected. But the reformulation did not reduce addiction. It redirected it. Users who could no longer crush OxyContin switched to heroin, which was cheaper, more available, and delivered the same high. States with above-average OxyContin misuse saw hepatitis C rates spike by approximately 225%. The reformulation did not solve the crisis. It mutated it. And there was a financial motive behind the timing. The reformulation extended Purdue's patent on OxyContin to 2030. The original patent would have expired in 2013, opening the market to cheap generic competition. By reformulating, the Sacklers protected both their public image and their monopoly profits in a single stroke. Chapter 4. The Great Extraction. Here is the part of the story that separates the Sackler family from every other corporate scandal in American history. They did not just profit from the crisis. They systematically drained billions of dollars from the company while the bodies were still piling up. In 2007, Purdue Frederick, the parent company, pleaded guilty to a federal felony charge of misbranding OxyContin. 3 executives, the president, the general counsel, and the chief medical officer, pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. The company was fined $634.5 million. Not a single member of the Sackler family was charged. Not one was named in the indictment. The 3 executives who pleaded guilty received no prison time. They were sentenced to 3 years of probation and 400 hours of community service for a drug that had already killed tens of thousands. And then something extraordinary happened. After the guilty plea, OxyContin sales did not decline. They grew. Annual revenue climbed to approximately $3 billion by 2010. The guilty plea had no meaningful commercial impact. It was a speed bump on the highway to a fortune. Between 2008 and 2018, the Sackler family withdrew more than $10 billion from Purdue Pharma. The scale of the extraction was breathtaking. In some years, they pulled out nearly $3 billion. They moved the money into a labyrinth of offshore trusts, family holding companies, and international accounts. They bought real estate worth over $1 billion. They accumulated art, jewelry, and collectibles valued at approximately $250 million. They established an $800 million legal defense fund. They were preparing for what they knew was coming. By the time the lawsuits began arriving in earnest, the money was gone. Purdue Pharma was a shell. The family had executed one of the largest asset extractions in corporate history, pulling the wealth out of the company and placing it beyond the reach of creditors, victims, and the legal system. Chapter 5. The Name on the Wall. For decades, the Sackler name was synonymous not with opioids, but with culture. The family spent lavishly on philanthropy, donating hundreds of millions of dollars to the most prestigious institutions in the Western world. The Sackler wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art housed the Temple of Dender. The Sackler wing at the Louvre contained 12 rooms of Oriental antiquities. The Sackler galleries graced the British Museum, the Guggenheim, the Smithsonian, and the Tate in London. The philanthropy served a dual purpose. It burnished the family's reputation with an aura of cultural refinement. And it created a web of institutional relationships that made it socially and politically costly for anyone to criticize the Sacklers publicly. Museum directors, university presidents, and cultural leaders who had accepted millions in Sackler donations were unlikely to speak out against the family. The philanthropy was not just generosity, it was a shield. But the shield eventually cracked. Beginning in 2019, a wave of institutions began removing the Sackler name from their walls. The Louvre went first, stripping the name from its 12 rooms in July 2019. The Metropolitan Museum followed in December 2021, removing the Sackler name from 7 exhibition spaces. The Guggenheim, the British Museum, the Smithsonian, and the National Gallery in London all followed. By May 2023, at least 20 major institutions had dropped the Sackler name. The name that had once been carved into the marble of the world's greatest cultural institutions was being sandblasted off, one wall at a time. Chapter 6: The Reckoning. In September 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The Sackler family, who had extracted billions from the company, did not file for bankruptcy themselves. They proposed a settlement. The family would pay approximately $4.3 billion over time in exchange for a sweeping legal shield that would permanently bar every lawsuit against any member of the Sackler family, even by victims who never consented to the deal. In October 2020, the Department of Justice announced its own resolution. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to 3 federal felony charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and conspiracy to violate federal anti-kickback statutes. The company admitted that from 2007 through at least 2017, it had continued to market opioids to healthcare providers it had reason to believe were diverting the drugs. The total financial penalty was $8.3 billion. Once again, not a single member of the Sackler family was criminally charged. The bankruptcy settlement wound its way through the courts for years. The Sacklers increased their offer to approximately $6 billion. Individual victim payments would have ranged from roughly $3,500 to $48,000 per person, for a family worth over $10 billion from a crisis that killed over 800,000 people. On June 27, 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States intervened. In a 5-4 decision in Harrington versus Purdue Pharma, the court ruled that the bankruptcy code does not authorize a release that discharges claims against a non-debtor, the Sackler family, without the consent of affected claimants. The non-consensual immunity shield was struck down. Justice Gorsuch, writing for the majority, held that the Sacklers could not use the bankruptcy of their company to extinguish lawsuits against themselves personally. The parties returned to the negotiating table. In January 2025, a revised settlement was announced. $7.4 billion, with the Sacklers contributing up to $6.5 billion. This time, without the blanket immunity. Creditors who do not opt into the releases preserve their right to sue the family individually. In November 2025, a bankruptcy judge formally approved the plan. But here is the fact that defines this entire story. As of today, not one member of the Sackler family has ever been criminally charged. Not one has been indicted. Not one has spent a single day in prison. Senators have demanded investigations. State attorneys general have called for prosecutions. The Department of Justice has reserved the right to bring charges. But no charges have come. The family that walked away. The Sackler family's estimated net worth today stands at approximately $11 to $13 billion. They still own over $1 billion in real estate. They still hold $250 million in art and collectibles. They still control Pharma, their international pharmaceutical network, which operates in over 120 countries and continues to sell opioids globally. Reports indicate that Pharma has replicated some of Purdue's aggressive marketing tactics in overseas markets. The family was barred from selling opioids in the United States. They were not barred from selling them to the rest of the world. More than 800,000 Americans are dead from opioid overdoses. Entire communities in Appalachia, the Rust Belt, and rural America have been hollowed out. Millions of children grew up in foster care because their parents were killed or incapacitated by addiction. The Sackler family funded their name onto the walls of the greatest museums on Earth, then watched as those names were scraped off one by one. They paid billions in settlements. They lost their reputation. They lost their name on the wall. But they kept their freedom. They kept their fortune. And they are still selling the product that started it all, just not in America. Arthur Sackler proved that a drug's success depends on the brilliance of its marketing. His brothers and their descendants proved something far darker. That in America, if your fortune is large enough and your lawyers are expensive enough, accountability is just another line item on the balance sheet. What do you think? Should the Sackler family face criminal prosecution? Or has the $7.4 billion settlement delivered justice? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to understand who really controls the world, make sure to like and subscribe to Global Status. We track the money, so you do not have to.